Monday morning, the Chinese PLA unilaterally launched the Justice Mission 2025 military drills around Taiwan without warning and announced that it would hold live-fire drills prohibiting water and air traffic from entering 5 areas.
That was a newscast from December 29th, when the Chinese PLA decided to launch the Justice Mission 2025 military drills around Taiwan without warning. Operation Justice Mission 2025 was the 7th large-scale military exercise launched by the PLA since then U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan in 2022. And these exercises are all simulating a maritime blockade. Now, for people in Taiwan, how can we prepare for a blockade? And are we going to run out of electricity? My name is Iris Xu. You're listening to The Divide.
I'm Stella Robertson, and I'm a reporter at Domino Theory.
Stella recently did an investigation on Taiwan's energy reserve. She asked the question, how long can Taiwan keep its lights on, as government agencies prepare for blockade scenarios? Now, what are Stella's findings?
Overall, it's a really tough question to answer, was my main finding. Kind of the more I looked into it, the more questions I had, and the more I realized that the answer really depends on a bunch of different variables. In terms of how long Taiwan could survive, I've seen estimates as short as a couple of weeks, because Taiwan has 2 weeks of liquid natural gas reserves, or about that much, and LNG is 47% of Taiwan's energy mix for electricity generation. But then I've seen estimates that are as long as a year.
Wow, that is such a drastic difference.
Yeah.
And when it comes to energy, the first thing that I think of is oil. Why is it not in your estimate?
Okay. That's a good question. Because again, that's something that I wondered about when I was just starting to learn about energy. Oil is interesting because Taiwan has about 140 days of oil in reserve, according to the Ministry of Economic Affairs. It doesn't have much installed capacity in terms of oil-fueled power plants. So basically what that means is that oil is like relatively easy to store and relatively cheap compared to LNG, but for decades, Taiwan has been reducing its reliance on oil as a fuel source for electricity because it's less efficient than coal and it's dirtier than LNG.
I see. And do we import energy more, or do we generate energy by ourselves more?
Import so much more.
So much more?
Yeah. Taiwan imports 97% of its energy.
From where do we know?
From all over, a lot from Australia, a lot of LNG and coal from Australia. Also LNG from the US, coal from Qatar, like all over. But really the main thing that I was concerned about is that it's all imported. Because when people talk about Taiwan contingencies, what we often talk about is the possibility of a blockade. And if that happened, what does that mean for Taiwan's energy supply?
So you see blockade as like blocking off all of the maritime energy imports, I assume.
That's one of the questions. A blockade could be totally full maritime blockade, and maybe the specific intent is to sort of squeeze Taiwan and apply pressure by restricting energy imports. This morning I was reading an article about how the US is working on an Taiwan-related energy act where they're thinking about situations in where there's a Chinese blockade and yet maybe fuel could still be escorted through the blockade.
The United States Senate Committee on Foreign Relations will be reviewing the Taiwan Energy Security and Anti-Embargo Act on January 29th. The bill was introduced by Senators Pete Ricketts and Chris Coons. It aims to expand U.S. liquefied natural gas or LNG exports to Taiwan. and to ensure adequate flows of energy shipments to Taiwan in a contingency. According to the two senators, currently Taiwan imports nearly all of its energy, and it makes Taiwan vulnerable to China's illegal, coercive, aggressive, and deceptive actions. Now going back to Stella's research, she's finding different answers to her question about Taiwan's resilience when it comes to energy.
There's so many variables, but I think what was helpful for me was figuring out what are the different things that impact how long Taiwan could last, so to speak. And then by understanding the kind of levers, I could understand better where Taiwan's vulnerabilities are. One interesting thing to consider is that when we talk about the amount of reserve days that Taiwan has of all these different energy sources, those days are calculated based on average daily use of the previous year. So when we hear that Taiwan currently requires 11 days of security reserve storage for LNG, what that means is that Taiwan has 11 days based on last year's average use. But Taiwan has different weather at different parts of the year. In this summer, it's hotter, and on some of the peak days last summer in terms of energy consumption was 15% higher than the annual average. So if part of China's calculation in doing a blockade were to be, let's apply pressure when Taiwan is in its most vulnerable position in terms of its energy demand, that might be in the summer. People I spoke to brought up this point, the energy consumption being higher in the summer. For example, Dr. Chen at CIER said that while Taiwan has 11 days average, if a blockade were to occur in the summer, its LNG supplies would only last about 7 days. So that's one of the variables, is time of year.
Stella spoke to Dr. Chen Zhongshun, Associate Researcher at Center for Green Economy at the Zhonghua Institution of Economic Research.
A related variable is, what does Taiwan's average consumption look like in a blockade scenario? Because again, these reserve days are calculated based on average daily energy consumption during peacetime. But how does everything change in a wartime context? So that's something I talked to Dr. Zhao at the Taiwan Climate Action Network, and he has an interesting model because his theory, with some caveats that he provided, is that by 2027, if Taiwan has increased its renewable capabilities, if Taiwan has 14 days of LNG by then basically he thinks that Taiwan could last a full year with its current energy reserves, because demand could be scaled back 70%. And the thinking is that during a blockade, Taiwan wouldn't be able to export, so maybe industry electricity use is down. So if industry electricity use is down 80%, that significantly cuts down Taiwan's energy demand. If residential use is cut down, you can't go to the hair salon, you can't go to the movies, there's restrictions about how cold you're allowed to keep your apartment with the AC, that could reduce energy use as well. So that's another thing. But the question with that is Taiwan ready and prepared to ration energy? I think this seems like an area where there needs to be a little bit more attention. And CSIS did an interesting report over the summer, and they were looking at different blockade scenarios and how it affected Taiwan's energy supply and use. And they said something really interesting about energy rationing, and they said that it would be super key for, before a blockade scenario, for energy rationing plans to be publicized and made super clear to the Taiwanese public, so that nobody is guessing and that nobody is surprised or unprepared. And I think something that I'm curious about that I don't know the answer to is how elastic demand, like sort of residential everyday electricity demand would be. And by elastic, I mean, like, is it really that changeable? Are people willing to not have their creature comforts that electricity provides, especially in an extended blockade scenario?
Now, rationing energy sounds interesting. Does that mean energy can be transferable between different sectors?
What do you mean by transferable?
Like you said, if we ration energy, right?
Yeah.
How can we be sure the energy that's been saved up are going into a different industry or use?
One thing that actually Dr. Zhao recognized when he was giving me these calculations related to a scenario where Taiwan could last on a third of its electricity demand for a full year. He said, well, like these calculations are based on the assumption that Taiwan isn't exporting, but what if the airspace is open? Like, what if TSMC can export chips like via planes? And in that case, it's a policy and political and sort of like a politics and business relationship dynamic kind of question about is energy being pulled towards industrial sector, like even during a blockade. So I don't know. I think that's a political question. I have no idea what the sort of like standard operating procedure for that is. And then on a more granular level, something I also don't know that I would love to know is if Taiwan is subsisting entirely on its reserves, what does the energy mix look like day to day, and why? So, like, why use this percentage LNG versus this percentage coal, and what's sort of the strategy with switching the energy mix day to day when you're not in like a normal scenario where energy is coming in. I think it comes in every couple of days.
We haven't talked about nuclear energy. Do you think that's a viable alternative?
I don't know if it matters what I think. I think it matters what the Taiwanese public decides. It seems to me as an outsider that it's kind of a point of, right now we're at a point of discussion and potentially change in terms of where nuclear is going, because there was that referendum back in August where I think more people said that they wanted to restart the Manchan nuclear plant, there weren't enough people who voted on the referendum for it to pass. But still, at the end of last year, the Ministry of Economic Affairs, I believe, they told Taipower that Manshan and Guosheng are theoretically able to be restarted. They're in good enough shape to be restarted since entering the decommissioning process. So, and it seems like Taipower now is sort of starting the safety checks, and there's a discussion going on about whether it's possible to restart Manshan, which the second reactor started its decommissioning process like as recently as last May.
At the end of it, are you optimistic or pessimistic?
I'm optimistic. Yeah, like it's Taiwan. Yeah, I'm optimistic. I think take my opinion with a grain of salt. I actually think that's like the toughest question you've asked me. Am I optimistic or pessimistic? Taiwan needs solutions. I don't think there's like one silver bullet solution that fixes Taiwan's energy vulnerabilities. Like Taiwan needs more LNG terminals. The public should continue considering whether nuclear is a good option, because that can be sort of, as opposed to like solar and wind and other renewables, it can be a more stable baseload energy source. I think Taiwan should include in its like civil defense handbooks and in its annual exercises should consider energy rationing more as part of preparation. Yeah, I'm optimistic, of course, because like one reason. I mean, I'm optimistic. I love Taiwan. If I'm being a little bit more analytical, there's so much investment coming in to Taiwan. NVIDIA, Google, like these major multinational corporations know Taiwan. They have like risk analysts working for them, and they're choosing to invest here despite energy vulnerabilities because this is a productive economy and the center of the semiconductor supply chain and a center of major AI innovation and growth. I think if this is where the money's coming, I think there's energy solutions coming.
What's our renewable energy generation power? Like, are we doing well on renewable energy, or are we underperforming when it comes to renewable energy?
So Taiwan, as of 2024, and I'll be interested to see what the 2025 numbers are, about 12% of electricity generation was powered by renewables.
12%, is that good or is that bad?
That's, I don't know if it's good or bad, but in comparison to like coal is 31.1% in 2024, LNG was 47.2%. The government ideally wants LNG to be 50%. For renewables, the original target for 2025 was 20%. That was later brought down to a 15% goal.
Is renewable energy vulnerable during a blockade, or is it less risky?
That's a good question. It depends a little bit like who you ask, because a lot of people like to talk about renewable energy in the context of nuclear. But if for just looking at renewables, it depends on the year, time of year, because, for example, I was just looking at Taipower produces every day. They say they produce like figures on power generation, and they get as specific as the type of energy and then the specific plant. The last time, I think the last numbers from last Wednesday, and there wasn't any renewable energy generation, but it's because it's been a really rainy week. But in the summer, there's a lot more renewable energy. If you look at installed capacity, which is basically like how much energy a plant could produce or an energy source could produce, there's a lot of installed capacity for renewables. And really, it's just a matter of the season and the time of year. So renewable energy is not a baseload energy source, and a baseload energy can provide the minimum like constant level of electricity demand because it's variable. And then another concern, particularly during a blockade, is that, and this concern was brought up in my article by Dr. Chen at CIER, and he said a concern that he has is that renewables increasingly connect to the Taipower grid via wireless. So if a blockade was accompanied by attacks on Taiwan's communications infrastructure, that could be an issue.
If you want to read Stella's full report, go to dominotheory.com or simply Google how long Taiwan can keep its lights on. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of The Divide. My name is Irish Xu.